Greetings. Welcome to a discussion on the Ten Commandments being a political theology. Today we are going to discuss the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. But before we get to discussing the commandment, I want to discuss for a few minutes what immediately precedes the commandment. In the verses immediately before the commandment, these words are written. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. This is a prelude to the commandments. It is a very important function within the commandments because as a prelude, it answers the question, why? Why should God's people follow the commandments? Why should it be the behaviors a whole group of people advocate should be followed? If there isn't an answer to why should God's people follow it, give us a reason. If we can't do that, there's no reason to follow the commandments. Ignore them, make fun of them, fight against them, but don't follow them. But if there is a reason to follow them, then we make them our own. And so these words give the reason why we follow the Ten Commandments, because God, about 3,000 years ago, brought the Hebrews out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Therefore, this is how God's people are to respond. Now, two other insights. The behavioral sciences tell us that when leaders give instructions to their followers, either this is where we're going, this is our goal, this is our destination, or this is what we're going to do here and now, and this is how we're going to do it, they seldom add why. Why is this where we're going? Why is this why we're instituting something new? Why is it we're doing this way? And if the leader doesn't answer that question, followers may not take the request or the direction of the leader seriously. They may just ignore it as if it doesn't exist, or they can rise up and resist the leader in many, many ways. And leaders know that if followers are going to follow them and they want to get something accomplished, they must always have the why. This is why we're going, this is why we're doing, this is why and what we expect to happen. That is what this prelude to the commandments does. The second insight is that the people who study and teach spirituality tell us that the one way to strengthen and deepen our faith and our relationship with God is to remember and identify where God has been present in our lives. So if I want to grow in my faith, or if God's people want to grow in their faith, what they need to do is remember where God was present in the lives of God's people. Where was God yesterday? Where was God last week? Where do we experience God's invitation into God's world last month? What about last year? And was God's intervention 10 years ago what is making us such a strong congregation today? And the more God's people can remember that God was here today and intervened yesterday and last week, what they're doing is deepening their faith and growing in the trust that God will be present today and tomorrow. What the prelude to the commandments does is to remind us where God was present in the lives of the Hebrews, and then in Israel, and then in the church. The prelude is an extremely important part of the Ten Commandments. Then, following the prelude comes the commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. Because I brought you out of the land of Egypt, because I took you out of the house of slavery, because I delivered you, I am the only God you will worship. I am the God you will follow. I am the God who has authority to give you direction. I am the God that is the ultimate leader in your life. Because God has done this, no other authority, no other belief system can replace God. Many years ago, I learned about a model called the indicative imperative model. And I've used it for the last 40, maybe 45 years. This model is extremely significant. And I think it's one of the best ways to talk about the commandments. And so here's the model. The indicative imperative model begins with the indicative. If you'll notice at the top of the screen there is the word God, then there's this bent arrow coming down to God's people. And what that indicates is God is always the prime mover. God always initiates the action. God always comes to God's people first. In this case, in the case of the commandments, God is the prime mover. God brings God's people out of Egypt, out of slavery. Even before God's people ask God to do this. The indicative imperative model then goes to the imperative. And the imperative is God's expectations because of what God has done. What God desires from us who are God's people. And because God brings the Hebrews and Israel and all of God's people out of whatever enslaves them, we are to have no other God before God. We are God's people, and we recognize God as the authority, the leader, the director, whatever term you want to put into that saying. Now, the example used in the prelude about the Hebrews, we're not the Hebrews in the 21st century. Nor do we believe that there are other gods. Christians and Jews alike are monotheists. They believe there is only one God. So how do we understand the commandment today? How do we understand the indicative? And how do we understand the imperative? Well, let's take a look at a modern day indicative and modern day imperatives. The indicatives of today, I'm going to mention three possibilities. And I invite you, as I'm doing this, to think of your own. The first indicative would be when a church building has burnt down. Many, many congregations have experienced the burning down of their building or the destruction of their building by a tornado or a hurricane or an earthquake. And the members of those churches know the horror, the despair, the great loss of all of the memories of all of the meaningful, significant events that occurred within that building. Many church members have cried. And the question gets to be, should we give up? But then something happens, church comes together, they get the committees together, they rebuild, they may even build a better structure to meet their current needs. The congregation comes back to be a blessing to the community in which it exists, to minister to its members and its non-members alike. Now I can see 15 or 20 years ago some leaders saying, we're facing a current problem, but I want to remind us of the days when God was with us when our building burnt down and we rebuilt it. And if God could be with us back then, God can certainly be with us today. And God can be with us in the future. Or, an indicative today could be because of a financial scandal. The church treasurer has embezzled $10,000. It was in an account that very few people look at, so it went unnoticed, but then there was a sudden bill and they needed the money, and when they went to the account, the money wasn't there. The congregation became extremely angry at the treasurer, but not only the treasurer, but the current leadership, because how could the leadership not know the money was missing? And trust was lost. Now, over some time, the congregation began to heal. People contributed to make up for the embezzlement, or it was returned, or somehow they got the money to pay the bills. And over time, the leadership gained trust with the congregation. And now, 15 years later, another crisis hit, and I can see the president of God's people in a congregation standing up and saying, I believe, because God was with us in that financial scandal, God will be with us as we deal with this issue. And this is what we should do. And then we get to the imperative. Or how about the indicative being surviving the COVID-19 pandemic? I'm recording this during that pandemic. I can remember back a few months when congregations were panicked. They had never streamed a worship service. They had never tried to hold a Zoom meeting. They never tried to figure out how to do Bible study online. And they didn't know how to keep in contact with their members through social media. 3 or 4 months later, I don't know a congregation that's not some way streaming its worship, or in some way holding Zoom meetings with its leaders, or in some way offering Bible study in a Zoom fashion, or who isn't using social media to stay in touch with their members. And when all of this is over, I can hear someone saying, you know, way back when all of this was happening and we were so naive, God was with us. God held our hand and we got through it. And so this is why we are not going to have any other gods before God who was with us. Now, you can add your own indicatives. I mean, every congregation has them. And as we remember those places where God intervened into our lives, that's where we build faith and have trust God is here today and tomorrow. Now, as there is a way to write the indicatives for a new day, there's also a way to write the imperatives for a new day. And so the imperative model would be this. Since we don't believe that there are other deities, but there are things that we can worship, how do we identify the things that we can worship that become other gods? And it has been suggested the way we find the things that we worship is we ask, what is the most important thing for God's people to accomplish? What are the major goals? What do we strive to achieve? And when we identify that, then we identify what other gods can be. Now I'd like to look at 3 questions who help us identify where the other gods are. And the 3 questions are, what is our purpose? What is our mission? Why were we put here? Purpose, mission, knowing why we were put here is the glue that holds God's people together. And so we make a list. Our purposes, our purposes, our purposes, our purposes. Our mission matches our purpose, and here's the list. And whatever winds up as number 1 on the list, that has the potential of being another god, if it not already is. Well, the question is, where do we find happiness? Now, happiness in biblical terms is not the celebration of burning the mortgage or Vacation Church School this year went just absolutely fabulous, and so we're having a party. Happiness is inner peace. Happiness is not having the struggle of always being pulled in different directions on which current fad are we going to follow. Happiness is being consistent. We make a list. What makes us happy? How can we be consistent? How do we stop following the current fad? Whatever ends up on the top of the list is another god, or at least has the potential to being another god. Or what is our identity as God's people? Identity is how other people see us. And it's the relationship we have with other people. So how does the community in which God's people exist, as a congregation, for example? Do they say that this local congregation is very much like a government agency that is the safety net for the citizens of the country, responds to hurricanes and floods and fires, responds by sending food to the disaster areas? Or do people say, that congregation really has its act together, it knows how to plan, it knows how to implement its planning, it knows how to manage its resources, it is really almost like a top-notch business? Or is the identity that the church and its congregations are just another very good nonprofit charitable organization to compete with United Way, the Heart Fund, the Cancer Fund, the Orphanage Fund, all of those letters that come to us where people are doing some very meaningful things? Or is that congregation somehow different because it is the people of God? And again, we make the list. And whatever is on top of the list is another God, or at least has the potential of being another God. Now let's see how the church, God's people, have handled this whole idea of the indicative and the imperative. And where has the church begun to find other gods? And I will show 4 different ways that the church has done this, or has been very tempted to do this. The Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, the Reformers were extremely concerned about correct theology, correct biblical interpretation. And if you believe the body language, the writings and everything else, this is what's absolutely right for you to believe, for our members to believe. And to be a member here, there is no deviation. For example, how do you interpret Peter's great confession in Matthew 16 when Jesus asked Peter, "So who do you say that I am?" And Peter says right back, "Why, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, the Messiah." And Jesus says, "Yes, and you are Peter Bar-Jonah, and upon this rock I build my church." What's the rock? Is it Peter, the man, first pope? Is it the confession of Jesus, about Jesus being God's Son, the Messiah? To belong to the Protestant church, it's the latter, the confession. To belong to the Catholic Church, it's the former, upon Peter, the man, the first pope. Well, there are three ways to understand communion. How do you understand communion? And does it match the official teachings of your church? That was a crucial issue for 400 years. And we can go on and on about 6 or 7 other passages, but the point was you better have the correct biblical interpretation. And that, when it's emphasized to the very top of the list, is another God, or at least very potentially another God. In the middle of the 20th century, the church began to follow society and began to say merit and success is what's really, really important. And this part of the life of the church, there was the church growth movement. There were books written about how to plan and what ministries work and how do you attract people for the sake of numerical growth. And because of the values of society, where merit and success were at the top of the heap, they became the top of the heap for the church, in that you had greater value if you had more members, and greater value if you had a bigger building, and greater value if you had a budget beyond belief, and greater value if your ministry portfolio reached beyond your walls, the local community, and even to the four corners of the world. Now, when merit and success is the greatest value, another God? Perhaps. The last part of the 20th century experience took the place of success and merit. It was said, instead of counting how many people were at church in attendance and how much was given this week and that week, the questions were asked. So what happened in church? Were you just moved by the organ prelude? Didn't the choir do great and didn't lift your heart? In the words of John Wesley, my heart was strangely warmed when I received the bread and the wine at the communion table. And at the end, what the leaders of the church wanted to know, did you feel the Holy Spirit moving among us as we shared the peace? Now, when experience gets to be the top of the heap, another God, at least the potential to be another God. Today, I think many churches would say social justice is the reason the church exists. It's our job as God's people, as our church, the very top, to advocate against racism. Is to advocate that there is equality among the genders. It is us to advocate that we are all God's children, regardless of our sexual orientation. What's most important is we show up for the protests and join Black Lives Matter to do that. But is that the purpose or just the ministry of the church? And when does it become another God? Now, I'm not saying in any way correct biblical interpretation or systematic theology or correct understanding and following merit and success and achievement is bad, or that experiences are somehow sinful, or that the church shouldn't be involved in social justice issues. What I'm saying is the purpose of the church is to love and worship God and to witness to Jesus and Jesus' love for all humanity and for the creation. And nothing can take that place. They are always on the top of the heap. And correct theology and biblical interpretation and growing and experiences and social justices are a way and flow out of the worship of God and the witness to Jesus as being the Messiah of the world. The commandment raises some very troubling issues. Now, before we quit and go about our daily business, I want to bring up one last thing. The commandment is to have no other gods is aimed at the heart. It is about what we believe and what we trust. Do we believe and do we trust God brought the Hebrews out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery? And then God was present throughout the history and intervened throughout the history of the Old and New Testament and throughout the history of the church. Because it is what's in our heart, what we believe, what we have faith in, out of which our behaviors grow. Jesus tells us that. And so this commandment not only says no other gods, but it says look inside your heart and make sure it's in line with what you do and what you hold up as important. It's a commandment about faith and beliefs and the motivation that comes out of faith and beliefs. Now, to keep the conversation going till the next time we get together, here are some questions that you might continue to consider when we say goodbye. Were there any surprises? Were you surprised at the prelude and then the commandment and what the prelude does? Were you surprised that both thought, heart, and behaviors have to be linked together in this commandment? Were you surprised at the definition of gods today, not as deities because we're monotheists, but as what we hold most important? These are good questions. They are surprises. Were there insights that will help you understand the Bible in better terms? Help you with a text you've been struggling with? Help you in ways that you read the Bible, what the prophets are saying? Were there any challenges? I know one of the challenges that I really wrestled with was the issues that the church was tempted, if it did not already do so, of the gods it had to consider over the last 500 years in terms of correctness and success and experience and social justice And while I've come to conclusions, those conclusions were challenged for a long time. And if you were going to talk to somebody about this presentation, you know, a member of a Bible study that you belong to that wasn't here watching it with you, or a family member, or anyone, what's one thing, and I mean one thing, that you would say, this presentation, this is the one thing I got out of it. Thank you for participating, for being here, for being a part of this discussion on the Ten Commandments as a political theology.